Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this video, I will explain about fantasy text. Do you know what a fantasy story is? Ever read it? Okay. In this video, we will discuss interesting things about fantasy stories that you need to understand. Do you remember when you were in elementary school, or maybe before entering school, did you ever read books that contain fantasy on unreal stories? For example, the story of the mermaid, the mouse, deer, Roro Jonggrang, or the famous Bandung Bondowoso. All the titles of the stories, including the text of fantasy stories in the form of fantasy from the author. You know, then what is the meaning of fantasy story? Let's identify the meaning, elements, structure, and types of fantasy story text. First, definition of fantasy story text. Fantasy story text is writing material in the form of an essay or writing to tell, describe, or imagine various action, experience, and event in the form of wishful thinking, fantasy, imagination, or more fiction. In other words, the things described in fantasy text are things that are not real or fictional. Fantasy story text elements. Well, here are the elements of fantasy story text that you can pay attention to. These elements are what make the difference between fantasy story text and other types of text. First, there is magic, strangeness, and mystery. Fantasy story text is a fantasy type of fiction story, an imaginative world created by the author. In fantasy story text, supernatural, mysteries, and occult things are revealed that are not found in the real world. So, in fantasy story text, the impossible seems to be commonplace. The character and the setting created by the author do not exist in the real world or real world modification. Second, story idea. The idea of a fantasy story text is open to author's imagination. That is not limited by reality or real life. The idea of this story can also be slice of the real world and the imaginary world created by the author. The story idea in this text is sometimes simple, but it is able to leave an interesting message. Fantasy story themes are supernatural or futuristic. Third, using various settings across space and time. The event experienced by the characters occur in two settings, namely those that still exist in everyday life and those that do not exist in everyday life. The plot and setting of the fantasy story has its own characteristic. A series of fantasy story events using various settings that break through the dimension of space and time. The chain of events in fantasy stories move from various settings across time and space. 4. Unique character having supernatural powers. Character in fantasy story can be given unique characters and characteristics which do not exist in everyday life. Character have certain supernatural powers. Character experience mysterious events that do not occur in everyday life. Character experience even in various time settings. Character also exists in different times and place, can be past or future or futuristic. 5 is fictional fantasy stories are fictional or not real events. Fantasy stories can be inspired by real settings or real object in life, but are given fantasy. 6. Language, the use of synonym is convey with strong emotion and quiet prominent word. Variation. The language used is varied, expressive, and uses a variety of conversation, not formal language. Fantasy story text example so that you can better understand the fantasy story text. I will tell it for you. Golden Cucumber. Once upon a time, there was a widow who had no children named Bo Srini. While going to the forest, she was visited by a giant who gave him cucumber seed. The giant said that he would have children through the cucumber seeds. Bo Srini went home and planted the cucumber seeds. After some time, the cucumber plant only bears one fruit. The color is golden. She split the fruit and was surprised because it contained a baby girl. The child was named Timun Mas. Long story short, the Timun Mas is an adult. One night, Bo Srini dreamed of being visited by a giant. The giant will pick up Timun Mas in a week. Bo Srini was afraid. Then she met a magic hermit. The hermit gave 4 small pockets containing cucumber, seeds, needles, salt, and shrimp paste. On the appointed day, Bo Srini asked Timun Mas to leave. The giant gazed after her. Timun Mas opened the first package. Immediately, the surrounding became cucumber fields and hindered the giant. As soon as she was about to be chucked again, Timun Mas opened the second package. In an instant, the surroundings became a grove of spiky bamboo trees. The giant continued to kiss even though it was injured. Timun Mas opened the third package. The surrounding area became a vast ocean. However, the giant was able to get through it. Terrified, Timun Mas threw the last package. The surroundings turned into a sea of boiling mud. The giant fell and died. Congratulations, Timun Mas. She met his mother and they live happily ever after. Okay, I think my explanation about fantasy story is enough. Thank you for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.